Maybe you've never broken anything. Maybe you've never yelled at someone in the street. Maybe you're exactly the kind of person who takes a deep breath, swallows it down, and moves on. But inside, something burns, a tightness in your chest, a clenched jaw, a voice you keep trying to silence, and you call it self-control, you call it maturity. But is it really? Be careful with anger disguised as strength, because often what we've learned to call firmness is just wounded pride. It's the fear of being vulnerable. It's the child inside you saying, "They don't hear me, so I'll shut down before I'm rejected again." And from that silence, something begins to rot, a kind of containment that isn't peace. It's a prison. Maybe you've learned how to hold back, but not how to understand, how to endure, but not how to dissolve. And the problem is, suppressed anger doesn't vanish. It changes shape. It becomes sarcasm, impatience, emotional distance. Sometimes it becomes physical pain, other times sleepless nights, but it never leaves, because repression is not mastery, and self-control without awareness becomes emotional captivity. Stoicism doesn't ask you to erase what you feel. It invites you to look at it directly, gently, and ask, does this depend on me? Because as Epictetus once said, it's not things that disturb us, but our interpretation of them. And maybe, just maybe, your interpretation of yourself carries more hidden anger than you realize. Today, we're going deeper into the layers of an emotion most people feel but few understand. We'll uncover why you still react like a wounded child, why silence isn't always wisdom, and why mastering anger isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming whole. But for that, you'll need to stay with me until the end, because the most powerful truth never comes at the beginning. It waits for those who remain. There's a part of you that never grew up. It hides well behind your firm voice, your rational decisions, your achievements. But when anger comes, and it comes suddenly like a spark that becomes fire, that part takes the wheel. It's that part, frozen in time, that screams without sound, punches without fists, demands without words. A wounded child, not weak, just tired of being ignored. Most of our strongest reactions don't rise from the present. They're echoes of old phrases that left deep marks, of glances we interpreted as contempt, of absences that became wounds. When someone interrupts you today, maybe you're not reacting to them, but to a memory of not being heard when you needed it most. As if your body holds scars your mind tried to forget. And this isn't just poetic. Neuroscience confirms what Stoicism has long known. When you're overtaken by anger, the amygdala, the emotional brain, takes control. And the prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment, for wisdom, shuts down, as if the adult in you leaves the room and the scared child takes over. But you can interrupt that cycle before the eruption, before the sharp word, the impulsive text, the gesture that wounds. Close your eyes, bring attention to your body, sense where the anger lives. Maybe in your stomach, your chest, your throat. Don't fight it. Just notice, give it a name, and breathe. When you name it, you light it up. When you observe it, you slow it down. And in that pause, you reclaim the steering wheel. The first flame doesn't need to become a wildfire. It can become the light that reveals where your pain lives, because every anger has an origin, and only those brave enough to look at that origin can one day turn it into lucid strength, into conscious action, into inner freedom. Often, it's not the anger that consumes you, it's the frustration of what you thought would happen and didn't. It's the gesture you expected and never came. The words you needed and never heard, the fairness you hoped for that never arrived. You call it rage, but deep down, it's the ache of a world that refuses to follow the script you wrote in silence. There's something noble in your expectation. You want reciprocity, fairness, balance. But what happens when others don't return what you give? When life doesn't give back with the same intensity? Anger rises. But this anger carries an attachment, the kind that disguises itself as justice, and that's where suffering lives. The Stoic learns to navigate life like a river, It doesn't try to move the rocks. It flows around them. Marcus Aurelius said, "Receive each event as if you had chosen it." That doesn't mean resignation. It means wisdom. It means seeing that while you insist on fighting reality, you distance yourself from the peace that could be born from acceptance. Positive psychology echoes this clearly. Frustration isn't about the other. It's about the illusion of control. It's the belief that we can shape the behavior of those around us, like characters in our internal script, but they aren't. They're rivers with currents of their own, and your peace can't depend on their flow. Maybe your anger isn't about what they did to you, but about what you expected them to do. And when you shift from demanding to observing, from insisting to understanding, something changes. You stop reacting. You begin responding. You stop fighting what is and start finding meaning even in what doesn't make sense. Not everything needs to go your way, but everything can teach you something you haven't yet understood. And sometimes the deepest lesson is letting go of what was never yours to control. Not all anger explodes. Some dissolves into silence, hides behind tense smiles, short replies, distances that form without warning. You don't yell, you don't strike, but inside, something crumbles. Passive anger is like a low-grade fever. It doesn't scream, but it weakens. It erodes your muscles, your sleep, your will. It clenches your jaw, blocks your throat, tightens your chest, and no one notices, not even you. When anger has no place to go, it retreats into the body. Wilhelm Reich taught that repressed emotions don't disappear, they store. They harden our posture, stiffen our gestures, lock us into defense mode even when there's no threat, as if you're still preparing for a battle that ended long ago, but still echoes inside. And the most painful part? This kind of anger is hard to name. It doesn't roar. It comes as a strange fatigue, a quiet irritability, a desire to isolate. You don't want to hurt anyone, but you no longer know how to connect. So you pull away, just to keep from breaking. But in pulling away, you drift from yourself. Stoic philosophy doesn't deny the body, it listens, because the body mirrors the soul. And when the body tenses, it's asking to be heard. It's not weakness, it's a plea for presence, for reconnection. Breath, done with cadence, with intention, becomes a bridge. Inhale for 4, hold for 2, exhale for 6, not to control, but to feel. To welcome what's alive and asking for space. Not every fury needs to be expelled. Some just need to be seen, felt, released in quiet, not to wound, but to heal. Because when anger meets a body that welcomes it, it transforms. It stops being a threat and becomes a path back home. You've learned how to be silent, how to count to 10, how to hold back the words stuck in your throat like a brimming glass. And yes, silence can be shelter, a space of pause, a gesture of wisdom, but it can also be a prison, because not all silence comes from peace. Some comes from fear. Silence out of fear is not the same as silence out of wisdom. One is avoidance. The other is choice. When you go silent to avoid conflict, to avoid more pain, to avoid being misunderstood, silence begins to rot from within. It builds up, becomes resentment, becomes emotional distance that's harder and harder to cross until you don't even remember how to speak your truth without hurting or being hurt. But there is another kind of silence, one that isn't empty. It's full of presence. A silence that listens, that observes, that holds without rushing. Thich Nhat Hanh called this kind of stillness the breath of the soul. Not silence that flees, silence that stays, that looks, that hears what even you haven't said. 3 minutes of conscious silence can reveal more about your anger than 1,000 words. When you stop reacting to the world, you begin to hear what's alive inside you. And maybe your anger isn't about them. It's about the part of you that got lost trying to please, trying to be strong, trying not to offend. True silence doesn't sicken, it heals. But for that, it needs to be alive. It needs to be intentional. It needs to come with inward listening, because silence that protects can also isolate. And wisdom lies in knowing the difference, in being silent not out of defeat, but clarity, in choosing not to respond, not from fear, but from strength, in listening, not to the world's noise, but to the forgotten voice of your own soul. There's a silent power in not retaliating, a power that doesn't shout, doesn't accuse, doesn't try to prove anything. It simply remains, whole, present, steady. It's an almost invisible power, because we live in a world that equates power with reaction, justice with comeback, dignity with the last word. But there's a dignity that grows in stillness, and it's stronger than any scream. When someone hurts you, every part of you wants to strike back, to restore balance, to give them what they gave. It's natural, it's instinctive, but it's also predictable. And Stoicism teaches that being predictable means being a slave to your emotions. Epictetus said, anyone can become angry, that's easy, but to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right reason, in the right way, that is not easy. It's not easy. But it's what separates impulse from mastery. Reacting is almost automatic, but remaining requires a kind of strength the world doesn't teach. It requires center, clarity, a sense of inner value that doesn't need to be proven. You don't remain still because you feel nothing. You remain still because you feel everything and still choose not to lose yourself. That is true control. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, humiliated, silenced, and when he was released, he didn't seek revenge. He didn't explode. He didn't demand anything. He used silence as a foundation because he knew that hatred would keep him captive even outside the bars. His silence wasn't a mission, it was maturity, conscious choice, liberation. Not striking back isn't weakness, it's freedom. Freedom from needing to be right, freedom from needing to win arguments, freedom from depending on others' behavior to define your own. The anger that visits doesn't get to decide who you are. And when you choose to remain, even in the chaos, you become the center, the shelter, the answer. Anger doesn't define who you are. What defines you is what you do with it, because feeling is inevitable, but acting is choice. And it's in that subtle space, between impulse and action, that your power lives. Most people are trapped in that space without even knowing it exists. They feel, react, regret, feel, react, blame. And so they repeat a cycle where there's no freedom, only emotional automation. Stoicism doesn't deny anger. It honors it as part of being human, but it proposes a pause, a window of consciousness between what happens and what you do with it. Seneca called that moment the sacred interval, a moment between stimulus and response, where the soul can breathe, where reason can step in, where wisdom can touch the emotion before it spills. In that interval, you can choose 3 movements. First, recognize, name what you feel. Say to yourself without fear, without shame, this is anger. Second, reposition. Remember who you are, what you value, what matters beyond this moment. And finally, respond with purpose. Not to win, not to dominate, but to stay loyal to who you are. When you practice this daily, something begins to shift. You become less reactive, more present, more able to hold what you feel without being swept away. A simple gesture helps. Write it down. Just 2 words. Old rage, hidden tension, old impatience. Naming is illumination, and what's lit up can't rule from the dark anymore. You're not here to be perfect. You're here to be aware, and every time you choose to respond instead of react, you're writing a new story. One where feelings exist but don't rule, where pain speaks but doesn't command, where anger is heard but not the one steering the way. There's a fine line between not reacting and going numb. And sometimes that line blurs without you noticing. Silence, which began as self-care, turns into avoidance. Restraint, once wisdom, becomes rigidity. And before you know it, you've gone cold. Not because you've found peace, but because you've disconnected from what still hurts. It's easy to confuse maturity with indifference. Harder to see when pride disguises itself as control. When "I don't care" hides "it matters more than I can admit." The true sage doesn't run from feeling. He simply doesn't let it define who he becomes. Epictetus said, "Ignore what doesn't depend on you," but he never said to ignore yourself. Ignoring your inner world is another kind of exile, the loneliest of all. The strategic indifference Stoicism teaches isn't emotional distance, it's freedom. Freedom from needing someone else's actions to maintain your balance. Freedom from being pulled into others' chaos. Freedom to feel without being ruled by what you feel. When you choose not to react, it's not because you're numb. It's because you've learned to choose what deserves your peace, your time, your soul. Picture a samurai facing an attack. He has the sword, the training, the strength, but he remains still. Why? Because he knows fighting without need is waste. Because he knows true power is internal mastery. And sometimes the strongest blow is needing no blow at all. That's the silence of the wise, not emptiness, fullness. A presence so deep it doesn't need to prove itself. Coldness protects, but also isolates. Wisdom receives, understands, and chooses. You don't have to freeze to avoid pain. You just have to remember that your peace depends on no one but you. And that true silence doesn't shut your heart. It makes space to breathe, to feel, to stay, without carrying what was never yours. There's a kind of strength the world celebrates, the unshakable one. But there's another, quieter, rarer that the world often overlooks. It's the strength of someone who feels everything, but stays flexible, who holds steady through chaos without turning to stone, who understands that being firm doesn't mean being hard. It means being like bamboo, bending with the wind, but never breaking. Sometimes you build walls thinking you're protecting yourself, but without noticing, you end up isolating yourself from what could actually heal you. Constant emotional reactivity, unexplained irritability, withdrawal from the people you love. Those are signs you've lost your center. And when you're off center, you lose the ability to choose consciously. You become a slave to the environment, to others, to anger that rises without warning and drags you along. Stoic philosophy doesn't want you to become stone. It wants you to find your axis. A place within that doesn't depend on circumstance. A space of lucidity that remains even when everything else collapses. That center is cultivated with presence, with small internal phrases that anchor you when the world pulls. "This doesn't depend on me, but my peace does," said firmly, said with soul. That phrase isn't just a thought, it's shelter. You don't need to become a wall to stay safe. You need to become a root, deep, centered, connected to something greater than the impulse of the moment. And when that root is firm, you may bend, but you don't fall. You may feel the anger, but you don't become it. Because you know where you come from, and you know where you're returning, always. Back to center, back to self. There are parts of you you've tried to forget, that you locked away in the basement of your awareness, afraid of what they might reveal. But what you don't integrate controls you. What you repress shapes you from within. And anger is often just the surface, the visible edge of a much older pain, the pain of not recognizing yourself as whole. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the sum of everything you deny in yourself, the thoughts you're ashamed to have, the impulses you silence, the feelings you learn to hide to be accepted, loved, admired, but what you push away doesn't disappear. The shadow doesn't dissolve in silence. It grows in the dark of unconsciousness. Every repressed anger holds a part of you that's been ignored too long. And the more spiritual you try to be, the more dangerous it becomes to forget that. Because real spirituality isn't all light, it's presence. It's the courage to sit beside your pain without trying to fix it. It's saying, "I am this too," and from that acceptance, transform what once ruled you. Writing a letter to your anger without judgment, without filter, is a symbolic act of reconnection. Not to feed it, but to listen, to understand where it comes from, what it wants to show you, what it's trying to protect, and then burning that letter, not to destroy, but to release. As someone who has seen and let go, not of the feeling, but of the grip it had on your story. You don't need to fear your anger, you just need to let it come out of the shadow. Because when the light of awareness touches what was once hidden, something dissolves, something is set free. And you, slowly, stop fighting yourself and begin to walk alongside who you truly are. Without fear, without repression, without shame for being human. In the end, it's not about defeating anger. It's about no longer needing to fight it to feel peace. Because when you see yourself fully, in light and shadow, in calm and fire, anger loses its power to drag you. It still exists, but you are no longer ruled by it. The truth no one tells you about emotional control is that it doesn't come from brute force or suppression. It comes from listening, from acknowledgement, from the clarity that rises when you stop running from yourself. You don't become strong by resisting. You become strong by flowing with presence, by letting the emotion pass through you without becoming it. And now, knowing all of this, what will you do? Will you apply it or forget it? Integrate or keep reacting the same way? Will you keep waiting for the world to change so that you can finally have peace? Or will you begin building that peace inside yourself, even when the world insists on staying the same? Only you can answer that, but remember, he who masters himself today rules his destiny tomorrow. Your choice in the face of anger doesn't just define this moment, it defines the kind of human being you're becoming. And maybe in this very moment, you're standing before the most important decision of your emotional life. Don't fight your anger, understand it, honor what it came to show you, and from that listening, walk forward. Not as someone who flees, but as someone who's finally found their center. If any part of this touched you, say it out loud or write it down. I choose the silence that listens. Let that phrase become an anchor in your hardest days. Let this reflection echo inside you, and if this offered you something true, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, but only if it means something to you. Only if you felt truly seen here. Your silence has something to say, and today it said a lot.